And it's great to see so many people here, and thank you very much everyone for coming along today. So I think we've got a very extremely interesting panel of speakers. And Dermot Malidi, who'll be chairing the meeting today, and whose second book on John Redmond is due out, is it October?
It will be on the 24th of October.
24th of October on John Redmond. He's already written the first volume of it. So it's just my pleasure to introduce Minister of State Pascal Donohoe. Thank you very much for coming, taking the time to come and open the conference for us. And I'm glad to say you knew actually a good friend of mine.
I did.
Anne Holliday, who's in Fine Gael and a founder member of Reform as well, a good friend of all of us in Reform. So without further ado, I could ask you, Minister, to say a few words.
Thank you very much. Well, good afternoon, everybody, and it's great to see so many people turning out on an afternoon like this. And I wanted to begin just by thanking the Reform Group for their invitation to speak here this afternoon on this seminar that's examining the role of the Royal Irish Constabulary in Irish history. I just want to begin on a personal note, as we've just touched on there, that one of the founder members of your own group is a lady called Anne Halliday, who is a neighbour of mine where I live in Dublin, and was a woman of grace, decency and honesty, she was. And she was very, very personally kind to me at the start of my political career. I had the honour of attending her wedding, and then the sadness of attending her funeral not so long after. And it was somebody who is missed in all the activities that she was involved in. As I say that, I just want to move on to a second personal note. I want to thank Mert for the opportunity to speak with you here this afternoon. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to leave you shortly after I speak. One of the things that I've learned upon my recent appointment of a Minister for State is that suddenly the number of commitments and things that I'm involved in have grown really exponentially. And I have another commitment this afternoon that I need to honour. So please don't take my exit as an act of discourtesy to you. I just have other commitments across the afternoon and weekend that I need to honour. And I think it's really, really appropriate that we're meeting here in Wynn's Hotel here in Dublin. And it's very appropriate for two reasons. The first reason it's very appropriate is a very contemporary one. Wynn's Hotel here is a centre of much contemporary political debate. If there's ever a referendum going on in Ireland, a campaign going on in Ireland, or any issue of public interest or moment, there's normally a meeting held in this room about it. Some kind of a debate, some kind of a public meeting. And I've spent many a moment seated here up on the top table arguing for referenda and arguing for one side of a particular argument. So I think it's very appropriate we're all located here this afternoon, given that kind of contemporary use. The other reason, of course, it's very appropriate, I suppose, has a bit more historical resonance. You're all aware that this weekend, of course, is All-Ireland final weekend. And many of you will be aware that this is a hotel in which many county teams can stay in here, or which their supporters frequently stay in here. And I'm sure the bar and the rooms here tonight will be full of people who are really looking forward to the fantastic occasion tomorrow. But of course, just around the corner from here, the founder, one of the founders of Cumann Lucas Gael, Michael Cusack, ran his civil service academy. And according to an author who looked at the role of that institution at that time, it turned out candidates for various branches of government, including the Royal Irish Constabulary. And indeed, Cusack's grind skills were the most successful in Dublin between 1878 and 1888, during which, as one historian has said, he was striving to create a rival sporting organisation to foster native games and sports. And I suppose that's a theme, really, or an example that illustrates, I imagine, one of the points he'll be touching on this afternoon, which is the very interwoven nature of Irish history. The fact that we have layers of different things going on, running parallel and running complementary to each other. We have one of the people who is involved in the growth of cultural and sporting organisations whose aim was to assert Ireland's separateness and distinctiveness from England, But at the same time, he was successfully training candidates to succeed in their entrance exams for the Royal Irish Constabulary and for the broader British civil service. And that leads me on to 3 points that I'd like to make in my opening contribution here to this. The first one, and this is something that I believe very strongly in, and one of the things that really got me interested in politics as a young man and as a young student, was a deep interest in history. That's one of the reasons I wanted to come along here today. But particularly in the way history needs to be made come alive. I've long believed that history that is not debated is history that will be forgotten. It'll be dormant. In turn, history that is forgotten makes our present far less rich and makes us all poorer in our efforts to navigate the future. And crucial to that debate is attempting to recognise history in its totality, attempting to give a comprehensive assessment of what happens in history. That leads me on to my second point. This point of totality is vital in any attempt to assess the Royal Irish Constabulary. When considering the role played by the RIC in our history, it's tempting just to see it through the prism of the War of Independence. But that would be wrong. Be wrong in the same way that it would be wrong to examine the RIC's role by ignoring what happened in the War of Independence. So we have to look at all of these things in the round and in their totality. Events such as the enforcement of eviction orders during the Land War, their role in the collection of tithes due to the established church, and the killing of the Loughnane brothers in Galway, and their association with Bloody Sunday and the burning of Cork must be recognised in any attempt to assess their role in our history. But while it would be wrong to forget these events, we must also recognise other dimensions and other facets in their history. Like any police force, their popularity fell and rose at different points. Indeed, during the mid-19th century, members of the RIC, and again I'm quoting from a history of that period, were respected for their competency based on training and examinations, possessing local knowledge that few others could get. Their force was successful in reducing the general level of crime in Ireland prior to the Constabulary of Ireland Act of 1822. The RIC constables engaged in what I would describe as community policing at that time, where they were involved in and integrated with in local communities. And in addition to their policing role, members of the force also developed local government duties and responsibilities. And of course, we have to recognise and look at the loss of life that was involved at all times during their history as an organisation. And then as the world slipped into the war at the beginning of the last century, the political environment in Ireland rapidly changed. This change had profound consequences for the RIC and for their members. As the War of Independence took hold, and with the boycott of RIC constables and their families being stepped up, RIC personnel had very difficult and very challenging choices to make. A history of that period notes that some had brothers in the IRA, others had long service in that organisation. All of them had a choice to make: resign, fight along the Black and Tans and the Auxiliary Division, or in other cases cooperate with the IRA. A huge diversity of choices were made by individuals all involved in one organisation. While many did resign and many conducted themselves in different ways, some decided to remain, some decided to leave, and some were involved in many of the most difficult and darkest moments of the War of Independence. And that leads me on to my third point, and perhaps my core point, which is that the involvement or the role of the RIC in Irish history is not a simple story to tell. History that is simple is often history that either is not accurate or simply does not recognise the profound complexity of choices facing individuals and facing institutions. I believe we need to remember and debate and think about our history in its entirety, and through doing that, and by this process, ensure this includes the role of the Royal Irish Constabulary. And as I look at the very large number of you that are here this afternoon, it's clear that appetite is something that is broad-based. So in summary, allow me to conclude by saying that the broader the memory, the better the understanding. And it is in that spirit that I wish you all a very productive afternoon, and thank you all very much for the opportunity to open this event. Thank you.
My name is Dermot Malidi, and it's my privilege to chair this seminar today. We have 4 speakers. The first one, Professor Ewan O'Halpin from TCD. Is he here?
He is here.
Sorry,
yeah.
here. Yeah.
I think Ken, or Jim McDonald's going to go first.
Okay. Jim MacDonald will be the first speaker.
Yeah, let's go back to Belfast.
Okay, so Jim from the is a member of the George Cross Foundation. He will be the first speaker, followed by yourself.
Okay.
Is that right? And then we have Jim Hurley, the historian of the RIC, and finally then Tom Carew, who's a former trade union official and grandson of an RIC officer. This day last week saw the commemoration and reenactment of scenes from the 1913 lockout. I think it's fair to say that in that the police were portrayed for the most part as the bad guys. Staying in the spirit of the decade of commemoration, I think as good a point as any to begin the seminar today would be to go back to this date exactly 100 years ago, and to consider the way in which the average RIC member of the time, or indeed a member of the Dublin Metropolitan Police, would have seen his future. In September 1913, the Third Home Rule Bill was 2/3 of the way through its parliamentary run. Most people expected it to be passed in sometime before the summer of 1914 and to become law, which meant that an Irish Parliament would be opening sometime in 1915. And under the Third Home Rule Bill, control of the police was to be retained by the Westminster Parliament for 6 years after the opening of the Parliament. But after that time, control would then devolve to the Dublin government. So in other words, sometime in 1921 was when most policemen would have expected to have control transferred to the local parliament. So most Irish policemen then would have expected to work out their careers in relative peace and quiet. If they were old enough, they probably looked forward to retiring before the transfer of control. If they were young enough, they may have, being people of different views themselves, being a mixture of Catholic and Protestant, Unionists and Nationalists, they would have had differing expectations as to whether they would continue to serve under the semi-independent or autonomous Home Rule Parliament, or whether they'd resign. But few, if any of them, could have foreseen the trauma that was about to descend on them in the following decade. In the 47 years before 1913, a total of 39 policemen had died violently. Now, in just 6 years after that day, or in just 6 years from 1916 to 22, 500 would die violently. In the single week of the Easter Rebellion alone, 18 would be killed, and there are many more figures which could be given out. I'm sure our 4 speakers are more qualified than I am to set all this information into its historical context. So I'm going to hand over now to Jim MacDonald.